What happens when the ultimate punishment becomes the ultimate disaster? Throughout history, executions were meant to be quick, final, and serve as powerful warnings to anyone watching. They were carefully planned displays of state power designed to show justice being served with cold precision. But sometimes everything went horribly wrong. Picture yourself as a regular citizen standing in a medieval courtyard, expecting to witness a quick, clean beheading. Instead, you watch in horror as the executioner chases his victim around the scaffold with an axe, missing again and again. Or imagine being present for the revolutionary first electric chair execution, only to smell burning flesh as the condemned man's body literally catches fire during a botched attempt at humane killing. These disasters often changed the course of execution methods forever. They exposed the barbaric reality behind society's attempts at civilized killing and sometimes sparked the very reforms that would eventually abolish public executions altogether. Get ready to discover the executions that went so horribly wrong they became more terrifying than any crime that led to them. The axe that couldn't find its mark. When it comes to botched beheadings, two names stand out in the history of execution disasters: Margaret Pole and Mary Queen of Scots. Both were royal blood, both faced the executioner's block, and both experienced death so horrifically bungled that witnesses never forgot what they saw. Margaret Pole's Nightmare, 1541. Let's start with Margaret Pole. In 1541, at 67 years old, she was one of the last surviving members of the Plantagenet dynasty, and Henry VIII wanted her dead for treason. The problem? The executioner assigned to her case was a complete amateur. Historical accounts suggest he might have been a random volunteer from the crowd, since the usual executioner refused to kill an elderly woman of noble birth. What happened next defies belief. When Margaret was told to place her head on the block, she reportedly said, "So should traitors do, and I am none." She refused to cooperate. The inexperienced executioner, already nervous, took his first swing and missed her neck entirely, gashing the back of her head instead. Margaret, blood streaming down her face, jumped up and began running around the scaffold. The executioner chased after her with his axe like something out of a horrific comedy sketch. With each wild swing, he managed to land another blow somewhere on her body, her shoulders, her back, her arms. Witnesses counted at least 11 separate strikes before the 67-year-old woman finally collapsed and died. The crowd, which had come expecting a quick, clean execution, was traumatized. Some vomited, others fled. Even hardened Tudor courtiers described it as the most barbaric thing they'd ever witnessed. Mary Queen of Scots' Grotesque Theatre, 1587. But Margaret Pole's disaster was just a warm-up for what happened to Mary Queen of Scots 46 years later. Mary's execution in 1587 was supposed to be a carefully orchestrated display of Elizabeth's justice. Instead, it became a grotesque theater of errors that horrified even the executioner himself. The first blow struck the back of Mary's head instead of her neck. She made a sound, witnesses described it as a groan that seemed to echo through the great hall. The executioner, panicking, raised his axe for a second strike. This one nearly severed her head, but not quite. Tendons and a small portion of neck still connected her head to her body. It took a third, much smaller blow to finish the job. But the real horror was yet to come. When the executioner triumphantly lifted Mary's head to show the crowd, shouting, "God save the Queen!" As was traditional, something went catastrophically wrong. The head slipped from his grasp, but not because he dropped it. Mary had been wearing a wig. The executioner stood there holding an auburn wig with a few bloody strands, while Mary's actual head, gray, balding, and grotesquely severed, rolled away from her body across the scaffold floor. Her lips were still moving. The silence in the hall was deafening. Then someone began to scream, and the screaming spread through the crowd like wildfire. Even the Dean of Peterborough, who had been reading prayers, stopped mid-sentence and stared in shock. The Margaret Pole disaster led to new requirements for executioner training. Mary's botched beheading contributed to growing opposition to public executions among the nobility. Fire, failure, and falling apart. Florence, 1498. Renaissance city Florence, that gave us Michelangelo and Da Vinci, was about to witness one of the most embarrassing execution disasters in Italian history. The victim was Girolamo Savonarola, the fiery Dominican monk who had turned the city upside down with his religious reforms and his famous bonfire of the vanities. Savonarola was the guy who had convinced Florentines to burn their mirrors, cosmetics, artwork, and basically anything he deemed sinful. Now it was his turn to face the flames, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The city had planned a spectacular public burning to match the spectacle he had created with his own bonfires. They erected a massive wooden platform in the Piazza della Signoria, the same square where Savonarola had held his famous rallies. Thousands of people packed the space, eager to see the end of the men who had dominated their city for years. This was going to be theater at its finest. But someone forgot to check the construction. As Savonarola and his two fellow monks were led to the platform and tied to their posts, everything seemed to be going according to plan. Then the platform collapsed. Not gradually, it just gave way all at once with a tremendous crash that could be heard across the square. Savonarola, still tied to his post, crashed down into the pile of kindling and wooden debris below. The crowd went from bloodthirsty anticipation to stunned silence in seconds. This wasn't supposed to happen. Executions, especially important ones like this, were meant to demonstrate the smooth, inevitable power of justice. Instead, they were watching what looked like a scene from a slapstick comedy. Officials scrambled to figure out what to do next. Do you just light the pile where it is? Do you call the whole thing off and try again tomorrow? Meanwhile, Savonarola was lying in the wreckage, probably wondering if this was divine intervention or just really bad Italian engineering. They decided to improvise. Rather than rebuild, they simply rearranged the debris into a makeshift pyre right there on the ground and reattached the three condemned men to whatever posts were still standing. It looked nothing like the dignified execution they had planned. When they finally lit the fire, the irregular pile burned unevenly. Parts of it blazed up immediately while other sections smoldered. The smoke, instead of rising majestically into the sky, swirled around unpredictably due to the uneven arrangement of the wood. Instead of leaving the square talking about justice being served, people left talking about incompetent carpenters and whether anyone had bothered to inspect the platform beforehand. Savonarola's execution disaster became a cautionary tale that spread throughout Renaissance Italy. Other cities began requiring structural inspections of execution platforms and backup plans for when the primary setup failed. The electric chair's deadly debut. August 6, 1890. The world was about to witness what scientists and politicians promised would be the most humane execution method ever devised. No more messy beheadings, no more botched hangings, no more burning at the stake. Just clean, instant, scientific death by electricity. The condemned man was William Kemmler, a Buffalo resident who had killed his girlfriend with a hatchet during a drunken argument. But Kemmler was about to become much more than just another murderer. He was going to be the test subject for humanity's most sophisticated attempt at civilized killing. The electric chair had been designed by the best minds of the era. Thomas Edison himself had been involved in promoting electrical execution, though ironically he was trying to prove that his rival George Westinghouse's alternating current was too dangerous for public use. The chair looked impressive: solid oak construction, leather straps, brass fittings. It looked like furniture that belonged in a gentleman's study, not a death chamber. 25 witnesses crowded into the execution room, including doctors, reporters, and officials. They were there to witness history, the first step toward a future where capital punishment would be swift, painless, and dignified. What they got instead was a nightmare that would haunt several of them for the rest of their lives. Kemmler was strapped into the chair with electrodes attached to his head and back. The prison warden gave the signal, and the executioner threw the switch. A current of 1,000 volts coursed through Kemmler's body for 17 seconds. His body convulsed once, then went still. "He's dead," announced the attending physician after checking for a pulse. Then William Kemmler started breathing again. What happened next was unlike anything any of the witnesses had ever seen. Kemmler's chest began rising and falling. Foam appeared at his mouth. His body started making involuntary sounds. Groans and gasps that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his supposedly dead body. Panic set in among the officials. This wasn't supposed to happen. The science was perfect, the calculations were precise. Dead men don't start breathing again. They had to electrocute him a second time. The executioner threw the switch again, this time delivering a much stronger current for a much longer period. What followed was worse than anything the medieval executioners had ever produced. The smell hit the witnesses first, the unmistakable odor of burning flesh. Smoke began rising from Kemmler's body. The current was literally cooking him from the inside out. But the horror wasn't over. Kemmler's hair caught fire. Then his clothes began to smolder. The brass fittings on the chair grew so hot they began to burn through the leather straps. The room filled with smoke and the sickeningly sweet smell of burning human flesh. One witness, a reporter from the New York World, vomited and had to be escorted from the room. A physician who had come to observe the humane execution later wrote that it was the most revolting spectacle I have ever witnessed. When it was finally over, and it took a full 8 minutes from start to finish, William Kemmler was definitely dead. But so was the reputation of the electric chair as a humane method of execution. The newspapers had a field day. George Westinghouse, whose electrical current had been used in the chair, commented sarcastically, "They could have done better with an axe." The 4-hour torture. March 28, 1757, Paris. What was about to unfold in the Place de Grève would become the most infamous execution disaster in French history, a spectacle of horror that would traumatize an entire city and help spark the eventual abolition of public torture in France. Robert François Damiens had committed the ultimate crime against the French monarchy. He had attempted to assassinate King Louis XV. His attack failed miserably. He barely scratched the king with a small penknife, but in the absolute monarchy of 18th-century France, even attempting regicide meant facing the most extreme punishment the legal system could devise. The sentence was death by dismemberment. Damiens would be tied to 4 horses, one attached to each limb, and literally torn apart alive. It was an ancient form of execution reserved for the most heinous crimes, and it was supposed to be both swift and symbolically powerful. The criminal would be destroyed completely, scattered to the winds as a warning to anyone who might dare threaten the crown. Thousands of spectators packed the square, including members of the nobility who had paid premium prices for the best viewing spots. But from the very beginning, everything went wrong. The first problem became apparent when they brought out the horses. The 4 animals selected for the dismemberment were supposed to be powerful draft horses capable of generating enormous pulling force. Instead, they looked more like tired carriage horses, past their prime and clearly not up to the task ahead. Damiens was stretched out on the ground with his arms and legs tied to the 4 horses. The executioner gave the signal, and the horses began to pull. The crowd held its breath, expecting to witness the swift, terrible justice of the crown. Instead, the horses strained and pulled, but nothing happened. Damiens remained intact, stretched painfully, but very much in one piece. The horses, rather than pulling with coordinated force, seemed confused and tired. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The horses continued their ineffective tugging while Damiens lay there, conscious and suffering, but frustratingly still alive and whole. The crowd, which had expected a dramatic climax, began to grow restless. Officials huddled together, trying to figure out what to do. Some suggested getting different horses, others recommended adding more horses to the team. Meanwhile, Damiens was enduring unimaginable agony. His joints were being slowly stretched beyond their limits, but not enough to actually separate. It was like being on a medieval torture rack, except it was happening in public, in front of thousands of people, and it was supposed to be his execution, not his torture. After 2 hours of this grotesque spectacle, officials decided to intervene. They brought out knives and began cutting Damiens' tendons and ligaments manually, hoping to weaken the connections enough for the horses to finish the job. This turned the execution from a symbolic demonstration of royal power into something that looked more like a public butchery. The cutting helped, but it still wasn't enough. The horses continued their pulling while Damiens, now bleeding profusely from multiple wounds, remained conscious and aware. Witnesses reported that he was still talking, still pleading, still very much alive. Finally, with 2 additional horses, after more than 4 hours of this public torture, Damiens' body gave way. But even then, it wasn't the clean dismemberment that had been planned. His limbs separated one by one in a prolonged, agonizing process that left everyone, executioners, officials, and spectators, traumatized by what they had witnessed. The Damiens execution disaster became a turning point in French attitudes toward public torture and execution. Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire used it as an example of why the judicial system needed fundamental reform. The horrific spectacle contributed to growing momentum for the abolition of torture and the development of more humane methods of punishment. Ironically, the execution that was meant to demonstrate the ultimate power of the monarchy instead helped undermine the very system it was supposed to protect. When mercy died with the condemned. September 20, 1586, London. Even by Tudor standards, What was about to happen to Anthony Babington and his fellow conspirators would push the boundaries of what people could stomach. The Babington plot to assassinate Elizabeth I and place Mary Queen of Scots on the throne had been one of the most serious threats to the Tudor regime, and Elizabeth wanted the punishment to match the crime. The sentence was the full horror of high treason, hanging, drawing, and quartering. But there was a crucial detail that would turn this execution from a demonstration of justice into a spectacle that horrified even hardened Tudor crowds. Babington and his co-conspirators were to be cut down from the gallows while still alive and fully conscious, then disemboweled and dismembered before their own eyes. This wasn't unusual in theory. The standard procedure for traitors called for them to be hanged until almost dead, then revived for the quartering portion. The key word was almost. Most executioners had enough experience to know how to render the condemned unconscious or nearly dead before the worst part began. It was brutal, but it maintained some pretense of mercy within the brutality. But someone, whether it was Elizabeth herself, her advisors, or the executioner, decided that Babington deserved no such mercy. The first 7 conspirators were brought to the scaffold at Tyburn. The crowd was massive, even by London standards. Everyone wanted to see how Elizabeth would deal with the men who had tried to kill her and restore Catholic rule to England. They expected brutality, but they also expected it to follow the normal, horrible routine they'd seen before. Anthony Babington was the first to mount the scaffold. He was hanged for the briefest possible time. Just long enough to ensure he was still fully conscious when they cut him down. What followed broke every unwritten rule of Tudor execution practice. Babington was cut open and disemboweled while completely awake and aware. The executioner pulled out his intestines and threw them into the fire while Babington watched. Then came the dismemberment, arms and legs severed while he was still conscious enough to feel every cut. The crowd's reaction was immediate and unprecedented. These were people who had watched countless executions, who were accustomed to the routine brutalities of Tudor justice. But this crossed a line that even they hadn't known existed. People began shouting for the executioner to stop. Others demanded that Babington be allowed to die before the dismemberment continued. Some members of the crowd actually tried to storm the scaffold to end the torture themselves. The execution, which was supposed to demonstrate Elizabeth's power and justice, was turning into a public relations disaster. But the horror wasn't over. The remaining 6 conspirators still had to face the same fate. However, something extraordinary happened between the first and second batch of executions. Word of the crowd's reaction, and possibly reports of the excessive brutality, reached Elizabeth herself. The Queen, who was known for her political instincts and her ability to read public opinion, made a rare mid-execution decision. She sent word to the scaffold that the remaining conspirators should be allowed to hang until they were dead or unconscious before the quartering began. This last-minute intervention was almost unprecedented in Tudor execution history. Queens didn't usually modify sentences while they were being carried out, especially not sentences for high treason. But the public reaction to Babington's conscious dismemberment had been so intense that even Elizabeth recognized it had gone too far. The remaining 6 conspirators were still brutally executed, but they were spared the conscious horror that Babington had endured. The crowd, while still witnessing a gruesome spectacle, didn't react with the same level of outrage and revulsion. The Babington execution became a cautionary tale within the Tudor government about the limits of public tolerance for brutality. Even in an age when public executions were common entertainment and extreme punishments were accepted as necessary, there were still boundaries that couldn't be crossed without consequences. Hours, scandals, and spectacular failures that shaped our world. These execution disasters weren't just gruesome spectacles, they were turning points that shaped our world in ways no one intended. Each botched execution exposed the gap between the ideals of justice and the disasters led to immediate practical changes, better training for executioners, structural inspections of execution platforms, and backup plans for when the primary setup failed. But more importantly, they sparked broader conversations about the nature of justice, the limits of state power, and the humanity of both the condemned and those who watched. These spectacular failures helped accelerate the eventual abolition of public executions and contributed to the development of supposedly more humane methods of capital punishment. Ironically, the very attempts to make execution more civilized often resulted in new forms of horror, as the electric chair disaster demonstrated. The executioner's axe that missed its mark, the platform that collapsed, the electric chair that caught fire, these weren't just individual tragedies. They were symptoms of a fundamental contradiction in the idea of civilized killing. Each disaster revealed that no matter how carefully planned or scientifically designed, the act of deliberately taking a human life would always carry the potential for horror. In the end, these execution disasters may have done more to advance the cause of human rights than any philosophical argument ever could. Sometimes it takes witnessing the worst of humanity to recognize the best of what we might become.